And I think that one of the best ways to understand researchers and the commitments they have is to understand the stories they tell about themselves and who they are. And certainly that's something that I've paid attention to myself in trying to understand my motivations, my interests. So I was born and raised in Edmonton a long time ago now, and I lived in Edmonton most of my life. In the same neighborhood, actually, and I have pretty deep roots in this place we call Edmonton. In Cree, it's known as wâhkôhtowin. And so I come from a family that's a mix of Cree and Métis, Norwegian, and I think there's definitely some English and Scottish connections as well. My dad's family is a mix of Cree and Métis, so deep roots in this territory here for however long it's been. And my mom is the granddaughter of immigrants from Europe. So I often like to say that the two sort of competing stories of the genesis of Canada are, come into confluence right in my own family, the story of my own family, and it's had a big influence on how I think about what needs to be done in terms of curriculum and pedagogy and my own commitments in education. One thing that's I think also important for people to know is that I descend specifically from the Pawpawshays Cree. So the Pawpawshays Cree were part of Treaty 6, and in this Edmonton area here we're a well-known band, a fairly large band, and in the late 1870s they were, my ancestors, the Pawpawshays Cree, were, a reserve was surveyed for them. But they never actually lived on that reserve because the lobbying began to have that reserve removed. And so the land was expropriated in the 1890s finally, and the people were chased away. So I grew up on the land that was the Pawpawshays Reserve, but we didn't know much about that, when I was young. I didn't learn about that until later. But things really changed quite dramatically for me when I got a job teaching at the Kainai First Nation. And those are Blackfoot folks, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and people might know them as the Bloods. They're commonly known as the Bloods, but they call themselves Gana. So I got a job as a high school social studies teacher there in 1993. And I was there 10 years. That experience changed my life. Growing up in the city, there are all kinds of things that I'd never really had a chance to experience or understand or even think about. And so down there with those Kainai folks, they kind of took pity on me, I would say, and really tried to teach me and to guide me and support me in trying to figure out who I am, in this work. And I remember one of the first days that I was first at the school and getting to know people. The superintendent, the late Joyce Goodstriker, who was from the community, she kind of took me aside and she said, we hired you because we need you to develop curriculum. We want Blackfoot themes, we want Blackfoot history, we want Blackfoot culture. And they used the Alberta curriculum at that school. So this was an interesting problem. And so right from my first day, I was in the midst of curriculum development, sort of learning as I went, I guess you could say. And so that really provoked a lot of really good things for me. And I think that time at Kainai High School in that community is really what spurred me on to do the kind of work that I do now, for sure. Maybe one last thing I'll say that be helpful for people to think about and understand in relation to my work is that I have two other names besides Dwayne Donald, and the first one I'll mention is a Blackfoot name, and it was given to me by elder, the late tall man. His name's Spitequan. And it was done in a community setting, and in Blackfoot you would say, Ni sto ni tsi tsi tapi paksum epio mahka. So my name is Epio Mahka. And that's, it refers to somebody who runs a long time or a long distance. So, but when I asked Tall Man to tell me more about that name and why he chose that name for me, he gave me that name, he went like this with his hands. And he said to me, he said, you got a group of people who live over here, and you got another group of people who live here. And he said, they don't know each other very well. They don't talk to each other. They don't understand each other. He said, what you're going to do in your life is you're going to spend time with these people, then you're going to run over here and you're going to spend time, then you're going to run back. You bring them closer together. So when he told me that, of course, that name took on a much deeper meaning for me about what the work was about, you know, and you know what he always emphasized to me when he knew about, you know, my family and this sort of coming together of different people. He said, that's your job. You're like a translator. You're like an interpreter. You try to help people understand each other better. So there's that, and then my Cree name, Mistahai Maskwa, Tsiga Sun. And so that's Big Bear. And people who paid attention in history or social studies class, they'll know that name, this sort of infamous figure in the Canadian West. And so I was given that name by Bob Cardinal. In Cree culture, bears, specifically grizzly bears, big bears, they're connected with healing. So their work is to heal, and one of the things I've learned over the years is that humans and bears are considered to be intimately connected, and one of the reasons is that bears, like humans, have to pay attention to a lot of different things because they're omnivores. They eat all kinds of different things like humans do, not just one or a few things. And so it's sort of more of an ecosystem sensibility and this idea of trying to get everything to work together, which is that healing kind of connotation. And so it's my view that Epio Mahka and Mistahaya Maskwa, they support each other, those two names. And it gives me a lot of guidance on what I should be doing as a professor in the Faculty of Education. I consider myself a student of curriculum studies. I think that my interest and passion for curriculum stems really from the realization that curriculum is an expression of like a confluence of all kinds of different interests and trying to figure out how to balance them. And my own sort of working understanding of curriculum is it's stories we tell about the world and our place in it. And so I very much have a storied sensibility, I guess you could say, when it comes to curriculum. And so for many years now in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta, I've taught an undergraduate course that it's called Indigenous Curriculum and Pedagogy. And really what I try to do in that class is to get away from informational approaches to Indigenous ways. I mean, it's necessary because there's still a lot that people haven't had a chance to learn about. But what I really try to focus on is bringing people together, all people, whoever they are that end up in my class, bring them together to think about how we can teach and learn from Indigenous wisdom and insights. And so because of the work that I've had with elders and the influences those have had on me, I would say holistic understandings have a big role in how I try to guide people. And so one of the things I've puzzled on a lot is this problem, I guess I'll call it, where in educational settings we bought into the notion that if you want to change the way someone thinks, that you can just tell them that they should change the way that they think. And typically we do this in the form of lectures and PowerPoint presentations. And so if I think someone is racist, well, then I give them a presentation on anti-racism, and then we assume that they're not racist anymore. And I think that's a highly questionable understanding of teaching and learning. And so I try to think about how I can address the spirit, how I can address the emotion, how can I address the body in balance with the intellect. And so a lot of things that I try to do involve, experiential type things. We go outside as often as we can, and just to try to think about our sources of inspiration, what they might be outside of textbooks or PowerPoint presentations. At the graduate level, I would say the courses are more experimental, involving holistic approaches to life and living. And in Alberta now, part of the teacher quality standard is something they call foundational knowledge of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so all teachers are expected to engage with those in their teaching. And so I've taught a grad course that, again, puzzles on that. What is foundational knowledge? How would we recognize it if it was in front of us, and what would we do with it? Those kinds of things. And along with, some other doctoral seminar courses that have to do with notions of knowledge and knowing. And really in those, what I'm trying to do is to, I think, trouble the false universalism that comes with our acceptance of Enlightenment-based philosophies as providing the answer to any important question we might ask. And I would say that the current context is so replete with falsely liberal or falsely universalized liberal philosophies that we're really challenged to imagine other ways of being in educational institutions. And so that's my interest in notions of knowledge and knowing, is really trying to help people remember what's been forgotten, I guess you could say. I'll use a reference here that some people might be interested to follow up on. It's a book called Masons, Tricksters, and Cartographers. It was written by an Australian, I think he might be a social anthropologist, I'm not sure. His name is David Turnbull. This book I find it so fascinating because what Turnbull's project is about is trying to show how insights and understandings always arise in local contexts. And it's only when they're connected to power and control that they get taken out of that local context and they're extended. He calls them extensions of knowledge spaces. And they become assertions in a universalized way. And so there's a lot at stake in trying to think about knowledge and knowing in those ways. And so what Turnbull tries to do is to show these examples, these case study examples of local manifestations of knowledge, and how, through issues of power and control, how they kind of morphed and became something different from what their origins were. Well, what he's interested in, and this is why I'm interested in it, is he wants to try to create a academic context where knowledge systems can speak to each other in equitable ways. And his point is that the only way is if you take them up in their particularities. And so at the doctoral level, this is something that we've experimented with, where I've asked students, sort of modeling what Turnbull shows, to pick a case study themselves that has to do with their own curriculum interests, and to try to trace out the development of this insight and then how it morphs into kind of the extension of a knowledge base, as Turnbull says. And I remember one student in particular who was a physics teacher had a lot of fun with that, just looking at physics principles and exploring their history. So that's just one example of things we've done. Some others I could mention in relation to the course on holistic approaches to life and living, which is led by the elder Bob Cardinal, guided by him. It's predicated on the Cree lunar cycle, which has been followed in this area for who knows how long. There are 13 moons in this calendar, or this understanding of time, and each moon has a specific name, and the name has to do with what's supposed to be going on ecologically at that time of year. And so what we ask our students to do is to study the moon and study particular places of their choosing, and to pay attention to what's going on ecologically in that area at that time, and to figure out a way to keep track of what they learn, what the place teaches them, what the moon teaches them, and then to come up with some creative ways to express that. So these are, I would say, experiments in knowledge and knowing, and really trying to expand and enhance how we understand what it means to be a human being. I'm also someone who, when I hear, wherever I am, when I hear someone read that land acknowledgement, it doesn't really inspire, I don't know what it would be. It doesn't inspire good feelings, I guess. It sounds contrived to me. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that when Justice Sinclair and the other authors of the final report of the TRC, when they recommended it as part of the calls to action, that institutions do land acknowledgements, it had good intentions. And I do think some good has come from it, because people certainly across the country are much more aware of it than they had been. But that's a common question I have from different people who say, what would you say I should do about this land acknowledgement? Should I read it? And usually when someone asks me, I say, no, don't read it. My advice to people is to speak in their own way about how they understand the life that surrounds them, and how they understand what it means to live in the place where they live. And really, the acknowledgement, as you kind of mentioned, kind of parallel to the anthem, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really align with the traditional teachings that I've had, and maybe I can just say a little bit about that. The teaching in general around here that I've been taught is that human beings were the last ones to arrive on Earth. And you'll hear other Indigenous communities will say very similar things, So before humans arrived, everything was at work and in motion on Earth. Everything to support life and living was at work and present. And humans were the last ones to arrive. And when we arrived, the stories tell us that we didn't know how to do very much. So we needed a lot of help. And so all these, more than human relatives around here, they taught us a lot. And our task, I would say, as human beings, from that worldview, is to try to live your life in a way that honors what we were taught at that time, to try not to forget what we were taught, and to follow those, what people around here call natural law teachings. And so when I think about, what do I say about what it means to live here, my mind goes to that, to honoring life and thinking about how I'm enmeshed in this life that exists around here. And at its best, that's what that land acknowledgement is supposed to do. It's like an acknowledgement in a humble way. You recognize that your life is dependent on all this life that surrounds you. That's the way I look at it. Yeah. I think when I think about my research trajectory, I'll call it, one of the things that's notable is that I think when I began this work as an academic, I was concerned a lot with the critique. And one of the central features of my work has been understanding the fort as a mythic symbol at the heart of the creation story of Canada. And so part of that insight, I guess, that comes from that is that if you consider the story that's been told in schools for many generations on the genesis of Canada, and I use that word genesis purposefully because it has that sacred kind of connotation to it. This Genesis story, there are certain symbols that are at the heart of that story. In other words, there are certain symbols that support the integrity of that story. And one of the most important ones is the fort. And this insight and its mythic character was actually a gift from our son, who's 22 now. But at the time we were living in Fort Macleod, which is in southern Alberta, and Fort Macleod is part of that mythic story because in Western Canada anyway, what we're taught is that Northwest Mounted Police were sent west from Red River, what we call Winnipeg now, to try and establish peace in what we call southern Alberta now. And so in 1874, they established Fort Macleod in the heart of Blackfoot territory. So this is the place where we lived. And like a lot of places in Canada, Fort Macleod has a fort recreated as a museum. And children are taken there regularly during the school year. But they also, has been a popular tourist site, and it's right along the busy highway there. And one of the things that they do in the summer at Fort Macleod is they recreate the musical ride of the Northwest Mounted Police, where they get on the horses and they do what they do. And they hire local high school students to ride the horses and do this. So when you live in town, they play this really annoying music whenever the horses are doing the musical ride. So you can't avoid it. It's 5 or 6 times a day that they play this music. So this summer that I'm referring to, our son must have been, I think he was 2.5 years old. Whenever he heard the music, he wanted to go check out the horses. And I had to go with him. I got really tired of this. But one night that summer, we were getting ready for bed, and I was helping him put on his pajamas, and he said to me, he said, "Dad, I don't want to be an Indian anymore." It was hard to hear. Still is hard to say. But like most parents, I was pretty good at not overreacting, so I took a deep breath and I sat down on the bed and I said, "Oh, is that right? Why is that?" And he said to me, he looked me right in the eye and he said, "Indians always lose." Yeah. It's stunning, was then and still is now, that at such a young age, he was able to articulate something very clearly. Like he went right at it. And, he grew up in a household where the message was quite different. He was surrounded by people who gave him a message that was quite different. And yet, he picked up on this very clearly. And so, right from the time he was born, the elders that I knew told me, listen to your son when he first starts to speak, because he's gonna remember things from before he was born, and he's gonna express them. Listen carefully, because he's gonna. So this is the way I took this. I took this as guidance from my son on what to pay attention to. So that's why I studied the fort. So I understand the fort as a social spatial organizer in Canadian society. It teaches us that there are insiders in this society and there are outsiders. And insiders do certain things and outsiders do other things. And it's like separate realities. And this is considered to be naturalized and necessary, this divide. And it's been my argument that most of our institutions, including universities and schools, are based on this social spatial organizer. So universities are like forts. And because of my family background and the mixed heritage I have, I really wanted to bring attention to this logic, what I call colonial frontier logic, and expose its falsehoods, and really try to promote repair and renew the relationship on different terms based on my own ancestry and the things that I was taught, from people in my family. And so the research, though, I think early on as an academic, it was important for that critique to take on the form that it did. And I think it helped a lot of people to draw attention to that dynamic. But maybe about 5 years in, I kind of had an existential breakdown. Because I thought to myself, what if someone was to say to me, okay, Dwayne, forts, colonialism, all of that, you're very, it's very accurate and very important, but what should we do instead? And I realized at the time that I felt like I didn't have a very good answer for what to do instead. And so I would say slowly I started to leave the critique behind and turn my attention to research that had to do with how we might proceed differently on different terms. And so I think that's where, a lot of the work with elders, a lot of the work with holism, thinking about wisdom traditions, thinking about sacred ecology, thinking about treaty teachings, and all of that really being guided by a métissage sensibility, I think. That's the way I understand what I try to do now. Métissage as a curriculum concept was initiated by one of my mentors and friends, Cynthia Chambers, who worked at the University of Lethbridge for many years and retired from there. So I was a master's student at the University of Lethbridge, and the first class that I ever had was with Cynthia Chambers. I had no idea who she was when I walked in the room, but that changed quite quickly. Cynthia, over the years, I've worked quite a bit with her, and so her story, along with the story of Erica Hessebelut, had a big influence on me, and their encouragement and my own, I guess, articulation of what I think métissage might be comes from that. So Cynthia grew up in the Arctic. Her father was a bush pilot, so that's how she ended up there. And so she grew up around Indigenous people in the far north in the 50s. And she actually went to residential school, but of course it was a very different experience for her as a white child. And she got to go home at the end of each day. But she has these very poignant, of course, and sometimes painful memories of that and who her classmates were. A little later on, once she became a young woman, she married a Dene man named George Erasmus. And George Erasmus is a pretty important guy in the Dene Nation, the history of Canada, really. He was one of the main authors of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. And so Cynthia married into this large Dene family and spent a lot of time with them. Had a few children through that marriage, and then later had another child with a Cree man. And then eventually got a PhD and got a job teaching in the heart of Blackfoot territory. So as a woman with Scottish and English roots, her question was, how do I tell the story of my life without choosing sides? And what does that have to do with curriculum? And so Cynthia started to look around, and one of the things I know that she was very influenced by was the ways in which the old First Nations people that she knew, especially the women, the way in which they told stories and the way in which they used language. So Cynthia became very interested in language, story, and agency, and the ways in which people express relationality. So when she looked around at different concepts and different ideas, she came across this idea of métissage, which I don't speak French, but of course it's a French word, French origins, connected to the uniquely Canadian word métis, although it's not the same thing. As I understand it, métissage was, during the French colonial period, was a derogatory term. And it was used to refer to the mongrelization, what they perceived to be the mongrelization of the French race, as they thought of it then, through intermarriage with people who weren't French, the colonized or the enslaved. And so métissage had this negative connotation to it. Now, as I understand it, during the post-colonial period in former French colonies, in particular the French Caribbean, so Haiti would maybe be the best example, some of the intellectuals there co-opted or took back that term métissage, and they used it as a way to describe the generation of culture in that setting. So interesting, because if you consider that the original inhabitants of a place like Haiti have mostly been killed off, although their blood does remain in some of the people that live there. Most of the island was taken over by enslaved people, former slaves, who come from all kinds of different places, and so they were left in that place to try and generate a culture, a language, music, all kinds of different things, as a way to express who they thought they were. And so this is métissage. And so Cynthia kind of read about all this and used it as a way to bring it back to Canada to describe a way to express relationality through story, through life stories, as they call them, and this ethic of relationality that can be told through story. And so over the years, I've been part of what we call a métissage collective, which is a collective of researchers across the country who are interested in very similar projects. And so we create scripts together, we perform them in different ways, and we have done that. And I think it's trying to combine creativity and relationality and story, commitment to story, as a way to reinvigorate curriculum, how we think about curriculum. Cynthia has a very important paper that I would highly recommend. It's called A Topography for Canadian Curriculum Theory, and it was published in the Canadian Journal of Education, I think in 2001. And in that paper, she asks the question from Northrop Frye, where is here? And so Cynthia's version of métissage, because of her relationships with Indigenous people in different places around the country, has been very influenced by connections to place, and how, as human beings, how we express our relationships to places as living relatives, and how our stories are intertwined with these relationships with places. And so a topography for Canadian curriculum theory has to do with thinking about curriculum in its particularities to place, and thinking about languages that belong in particular places, and thinking about languages of our own to describe ourselves and our cultures and our identities, interpretive tools that we can use to make sense of all of this. And so this call for a topography, I think, spoke directly to me as someone who puzzled for a long time on those questions of, who am I? Where do I belong? Where is here? So métissage was something that I really connected with strongly as a master's student, and really guided a lot of things that I did. And through that process, I managed to try and articulate something that I called Indigenous métissage. So Indigenous métissage is not métissage just for Indigenous people. The way I conceptualized it was as a way to attend to the particularities of place. And so it's an inquiry. Indigenous métissage, I would say, is a research sensibility, or an inquiry that begins with an artifact. And so I define artifacts very, very loosely, very openly. It can be something created by humans, like a map or a photograph or some other piece of art, or it can be things that occur naturally in the world that humans interact with. So the inquiry into Indigenous métissage begins with an artifact, and we have to understand that artifact as connected to a particular place. So it belongs in that place. That's where it makes sense. And then the third part, so artifact, place, Indigenous métissage is focused on Indigenous Canadian relations, and trying to inquire into the difficulty of that relationship, and creating stories for us to understand the relationships differently, to understand them in their complexities, and to, I guess, use those to guide new stories about this country and what it means to live here, separate from, I guess, what I was taught when I was in school. I did publish a paper in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, I think it might have been in 2011. It's a paper called Indigenous Métissage, Decolonizing Research Sensibility. And then there's also a paper that is I guess I thought of it as an example of Indigenous métissage. It's published in the Manitoba First Nations Educational Resource Journal. I think it's called First Nations Education in 2009, and that had to do with, I think it's called Fort's Curriculum and Indigenous Métissage. I would say probably in the last 5 to 8 years of my work, I've become less interested in writing and publishing. I think there's a lot of value in that, and certainly I've learned a lot more, but I guess I'm interested in challenging myself to expand how I think about learning and different ways to learn. And so right next to the University of Alberta campus is a beautiful river valley. And the river, in English, it's known as the North Saskatchewan River, but its real name is Gi Saskatchewane Tsiipi. And in the Cree language, the translation would be it's a river that moves at a walking pace. And so it's a beautiful river and valley that we have right next to us. And so what I've started to do is to take groups of students and educators really in the Edmonton area, and students, K-12 students, into the river valley regularly and tell them stories about the place. And I use the metaphor of pentimento. So pentimento is a term that I came across literally just browsing in the library and looking for ideas, and I came across a book called American Pentimento. And I became curious with the term and looked it up, and it turns out it has to do with the study of painting, which I don't know anything about really. But I learned that people are interested in interpreting works of art, paintings, beneath the facade. So trying to think about the layers of creativity beneath the facade, and trying to think about how the artists struggled to express what they finally left on the facade. And in the 60s, they developed technology where they could X-ray works of art, paintings, and see the layers that were covered over. This is pentimento. This is this interpretive work of pentimento. So right away when I read about that, I thought about places in the same way. If you take a place like Edmonton, it has a facade. We interact with it the way it looks now, and I think an important thing to do is to go beneath the facade and think about the layers of memory, experience, and story that exist beneath that facade. And so this is what really inspires this River Valley Walk. And so the other thing is that right next to campus is an ancient gathering place that's well known in oral tradition in this area. Pehonan is what it's known as, and in the Cree language that refers to a waiting place or a gathering place. So right next to the U of A campus along the North Saskatchewan River, people have gathered for thousands of years in that spot to trade, to renew relations, to do ceremonies together. And what I do with anyone who wants to come along is we take about a 2-hour walk and I tell them stories, some more recent, some more ancient, about that place. And really try to deepen their understanding of its character. And it seems to have had a significant effect on a lot of students. And I've encountered, sometimes I have seniors groups that want to come along. And I've encountered people who have lived, 50, 60 years in Edmonton. They've never heard any of the stories that I've told them before. So it can be quite emotional for people as well to realize there's so much that they haven't been told. No one's told them. And so I think that experience in itself and the opportunities to interact with people in holistic ways has really got me much more interested in getting away from just public publishing and write. Some people have said, after listening to the stories of a River Valley Walk, some people say, well, you should publish those. And of course my first thought is, well, maybe not. Maybe there's something really important for us with just talking together in these ways and being together, surrounded by life, and and thinking about things in those ways. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that I think is really important is that more and more in my life I've been influenced by wisdom concepts in the Cree language specifically. And one that I wanted to mention that really guides a lot of my work and my research interests is wâhkôhtowin. And wâhkôhtowin in the Cree language, if you ask people who know the language to give you a simple definition, they would say it's about relationship. But more specifically, wâhkôhtowin teaches us about kinship. So at a human-to-human level, wâhkôhtowin involves teachings about how you related to other human beings. So it teaches you about your relatives, about your extended family, and how to refer to them, how to interact with them in those traditional ways. But wâhkôhtowin also has a more than human element to it. So it teaches, as I was saying earlier, that we are enmeshed and entangled in a whole bunch of relationships that we depend upon for our survival. And one of the elders that I work with told me several years ago, he said, the most important thing you can do in your work is connect people to the gifts that exist in the place where they live. Because once they see those gifts as part of their own identity, they're more likely to want to protect them. And he said, and that's when we come alongside each other in that treaty relationship, is when we understand each other as connected in that wâhkôhtowin way. But I think the most important aspect of wâhkôhtowin that I wanted to share is that etymologically, as a hermeneutic scholar, I'm also interested in etymologies. That word wâhkôhtowin is comprised of wâki, which refers to something that's bent or curved. And so wâki, and the next word that connects with it is bimote, which has to do with walking. It means to walk. And the ending, win, that's a nominalizer. So that's a way in the Cree language that you convert a motion or a movement into a noun, into a concept. So wâhkôhtowin literally refers to this idea of walking together in a bent over way, holding hands. So that, I would say, that's what guides my research, is getting people together, whoever they are. I try not to exclude anyone. Getting them together in a way, they hold hands, they're bent over, looking at the land, looking at the gifts, and they walk together, they move together. And what I've learned is that there's a lot of healing that comes from that. Because it's my view that one of the most difficult legacies that we have to recover from is colonialism. And I define colonialism as an extended process of denying relationships. So I would say that there are several different relationships that have been denied, continue to be denied, that I could draw your attention to, but I'll speak of three. So the first one, which is still predominant in most educational settings that I've been in, is the denial of the relationship that exists between your mind and the rest of you. This separation that's a major byproduct of the colonial project, I would say, that everything, is generated from above your eyebrows and a little bit to the right. And in schools, the message is the only purpose of the rest of your body is to take your brain around from class to class, right? And I'm quite troubled by the perpetuation of that relationship denial. So the next relationship that's been denied that I'll mention is the relationship that exists between you and people who don't look like you, or people who don't pray like you, or people who don't speak like you. And the last one is the denial of the relationship that exists between you and what allows you to live. And so here I'm speaking, of course, about the water, the sun, the earth, the wind, all these things that our elders draw our attention to. And so if I'm accurate in that assessment that we have inherited a legacy of relationship denial, then I think the most important thing I can do is to repair those relationships that have been denied and renew them on different terms. And so I think in all the teaching and research I do, this is a fundamental principle, fundamental guiding principle. What are the relationships that have been denied? What's the damage that's been done? How can we heal, renew, and then continue on, proceed differently? Yeah, happily, you know. I think it's important for people to remember that this trouble we're going through right now with the pandemic, it was predicted. It was expected, actually. And from many different people and contexts, it was suggested that this was going to happen. And what I guess what I pay attention to is how, in a certain way, we've been, I'll speak for myself, I've been trained and educated to think that we had everything figured out and we could avoid that. You know, we were bigger, better, smarter, faster, stronger, and it was just going to keep getting better. And so I've been paying attention myself to how I've kind of been seduced by that and caught up in that. And so I think, you know, what I say to students in relation to that, and I would say that this is certainly a heightened crisis that we're in right now, but it's been growing for many years. And I would say that in my classes and the students I work with, and I'm sure you've noticed it as well, is that there has been an epidemic of loneliness. And I think many people are mourning, have been mourning the loss of a tradition in their lives that could give meaning and purpose to what this is about, what we're supposed to be doing. I've certainly noticed it in my classes that sometimes I have students who, usually they're young women, who sob and weep in class, and of course they're embarrassed about it, but I think that there's a desire to belong and to understand that you know, petrocapitalism hasn't provided. So, and I think this pandemic has brought that much more to the surface now. This lack, this emptiness. I guess what I'll mention is that a lot of Indigenous communities and traditions that I'm aware of have indicated that we're on the cusp of an era, of the growing of a new era, a new awareness. But it's also considered a dangerous time. So it's a time of opening, but it's also, that opening also provides danger. It's possible that it could not, you know, it could go in ways that are against life, I guess I'll say. But, you know, for example, the Anishinaabe people, it's fairly well known, they've made it known publicly that in their tradition they measure time according to fires. And so this time that's arising now they refer to as the eighth fire. And it's a time, again, for a possibility of a different way of living. But it's dangerous and can be. Maybe I'll share too that in 2012, so the year significant for this story, in 2012 I went to Lethbridge. The University of Lethbridge was hosting a symposium involving tribal colleges from Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And it was mostly to share ideas and struggles, and just meet people and connect. And so I went just to try to learn from all of this, and right from the moment I entered into the room where the conference was being held, I noticed this beautiful, tiny old woman, who later I learned was she's a Mayan woman from southern Mexico, who had come along with her contingent. And throughout the morning, I was kind of distracted with watching her, because she kind of had this aura around her of wisdom, right? And I wanted to hear her speak. So finally she did speak, and she needed the help of a translator, and they had to get a kind of a stool for her too, because she was so short. They couldn't see her behind the podium. But anyway, they figured all that out, and the first thing she said, I remember in kind of a humorous way, of course, was she said, "Don't worry, the world's not going to end," because it was 2012, and there was this idea that the Mayan calendar predicted that the world was going to end, and she said, "Don't worry, that's not true. It's going to be okay." She said, "What our calendar tells us is that things are going to change, and of course, we don't know how, but we know things are going to change." But she said to us, she said, when the newcomers arrived in our territory, the Spanish, she said, we tried to greet them in that ancient way as relatives, and we hoped that they would remember how to greet us as relatives, but right away we realized that they had forgotten how to greet us in that way. So she said our ancestors knew that we were in trouble, there was going to be trouble. She said what they started to do is they began educating the young people in caves in secret, as a way to continue the traditions and the language and the stories, because she said because they knew we were going to need them. And so she said where she was from, this has continued for 500 years of educating young people in caves in secret. What she said was, what we know is that 2012, with this new era, this calendar tells us is that it's time for us to come out of the caves. She said what we remembered the world needs now. And so we have to start sharing what we've learned or what we remembered. And as soon as she said that, right away I thought of my own tradition, my own people around here, and there is on the prairies here, there is a white buffalo prophecy that's in very similar ways is about renewal, or the chance for renewal. Things are going to change, but there is a chance for a new beginning. And so with climate change, with the pandemic, and with all the concerns for sustainability, this has been a central message that I've had with students. It has to do with there are other ways to live outside of what I've called homo economicus and whatever the Alberta government is promoting these days. There are other ways to be a human being. People have been living in this area for thousands of years quite successfully, and maybe it's time for all of us to remember some of that wisdom and make it part of our daily lives. And that's really, I think in the work that I do, especially with the elders, the focus is on everyday, regular life practices that everyone can adopt and make part of how they live. That's what he focuses on. And so I follow that. So instead of these giant field trips where we go to the mountains and we do special things, I mean, there's good with that. But yeah, I'm much more interested in trying to help people think about everyday life and how to work on that, I guess. Yeah. Well, teaching a class right now with the elder, and we went on we spent the day together with the group that is part of it. We're together for a whole trip around the sun. And so in the summertime now, if we follow that sort of traditional rhythm, this is a time for traveling. This is a time for gathering and those kinds of things. And so we got together and did a ceremony led by the elders that really had to do with approaching places as living relatives. And we talked a lot about that sort of practice that is common in archaeological or scientific ways, where regard a place as dead. And so the work of the archaeologist is almost to perform an autopsy, where you're digging into that place, and it's like a forensic autopsy, where, okay, this is what this place used to mean. So we're trying to think about it in terms of how can we think of this piece of land, this place, as already alive, and how can we feed this place, and how can this place feed us back? And again, the focus was on, these are things that you can do yourself, your own way. And then the other thing we did was to pick medicine. In this case it was sage, which is a medicine very common here on the prairie. So just showing people the protocols associated with how to do that, and how to use that medicine. And just like the elder said, connect people with the gifts that exist in their own place, and show them how to feed them. So that's a one practical example. I guess one thing that's on my mind right now, Karen, is that I can share is my interest lately in what I'm calling unlearning colonialism. So I'm really trying to work with this as a pedagogical concept. And here, I guess I'll take a risk, and I'll speak about truth and reconciliation. And I'm like, I think a number of scholars, I don't feel like what I'm about to say is unique, but not so much a skepticism of truth and reconciliation, but a wariness. And at the institution that I work at, the University of Alberta, I've said publicly that truth is one thing we can talk about, and reconciliation is something else. And I don't believe that institutions like the one I work at know how to speak the language of reconciliation. They haven't been created to do that, and it's troubling when they try to champion it as something that they're at the leading on, because I don't think there's been much careful thought on what that really means. And many Indigenous scholars have, and I'll use Tayaki Alfred as one Mohawk scholar who basically says that reconciliation, the message has been that Canada and Canadians will allow Indigenous people to maybe learn their language or practice their culture, but the land is not up for negotiation, and the resources are not up for negotiation. So some people say that reconciliation will only happen when Indigenous people get the land back. Right? So those are things that I think about a lot, but specific to faculties of education, teacher education, curriculum, what I see is that we have the current context, which is, I would say in the past decade, has definitely gotten better. Like in the faculty of education that I work at, has been a qualitative shift in how people understand Indigenous issues and themes. The students I work with are much more informed than they were 10 years ago. But in this current context we're in right now, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But my view is that institutions have a tendency to pass over the colonial terrain and all these difficulties, and they go to reconciliation because it's quite pleasant to think about reconciliation. And I would say the idea of reconciliation supports, in many ways, the ways in which Canadians prefer to think of themselves as a people in terms of peacemakers and friendly, you know. And so this passing over of this difficult terrain is what I've paid attention to. And so that's why unlearning has become an important concept for me. So what does it take to unlearn colonialism? By what processes can it take place? And I think it's colonialism. I think we have to understand it as an ideology that has very, it's not just an intellectual project, it's an embodied kind of thing. People wear it, carry it in their skin, on their bodies, this relationship denial. And so this idea of unlearning is something that has my attention, and I really don't think that we can make much progress on anything related to truth and reconciliation until we unlearn colonialism. The former chief of the Tsuut'ina Nation, which is, the Tsuut'ina Nation is just right up against the city of Calgary on the southwest corner of Calgary. The former chief, Lee Crowchild, gave a keynote address at a model UN conference that was hosted by Concordia University of Edmonton at the Banff Centre. This is a few years ago. And Chief Crowchild was talking about truth and reconciliation as the chief of his First Nation. And as far as I know, most of the delegates that attended this were not Indigenous. So this was new for them. He said when he first heard that word reconciliation, he wondered what it meant. And so he asked a few different people. And what he noticed is that he got a different answer from everyone he asked. So he looked in the dictionary eventually, and it said something about to apologize or atone for wrongdoing. And he said, when I saw that, I thought, well, that doesn't have anything to do with us. Speaking of his community, he said, because we didn't do anything wrong. So he said that leaves truth. And at that point, he started talking about a tradition on the prairies here that I'd heard about from Blackfoot folks. It's called the Wolf Lodge. So the Wolf Lodge was a kind of a shared ceremony, people on the prairies, and it had to do with conflict resolution. So if communities were in conflict, a Wolf Lodge was used as a way to bring people together. And what they would do is they would have a ceremonial aspect to it, but eventually they would end up in the teepee, and the conflicting sides would face each other. And what they would try to do is they would try to arrive at a shared understanding of what had transpired between them. Through sharing their stories and accounts, they would try to reach an agreement. And what he said is that if they couldn't agree, there would be no peace. And he finished all that by saying that Canada needs a Wolf Lodge. And so I thought of that when you were talking about what we call political correctness, and how it seems like this need to have these hard conversations and speak to each other in direct terms is increasingly avoided in settings where they're really necessary. And so I think that this idea of unlearning colonialism has something to do with this Wolf Lodge concept that Chief Crowchild was talking about. And this idea of unlearning is something I came across just in some literature, and a lot of it has to do with this idea of unlearning learning theories and how they I guess tend to override the ways in which people understand teaching and learning. But for me, I'm interested in thinking about unlearning in terms of colonialism. Colonialism as an ideology is it's not just an intellectual habit. It's an embodied kind of understanding. When you're colonized, you carry it in your skin, you carry it, inside of you. It has a very deep effect on how you participate in the world. And this is what needs to be unlearned, is this habit, this acceptance of relationship denial in all the different forms that I've talked about. And so I'm interested in promoting unlearning colonialism as a pedagogical concept and trying to think about it in holistic ways. And a lot of it has to do with what I call paradigmatic provocations. In other words, trying to put people in settings that they're not used to, and asking them to consider knowledge and knowing, teaching and learning in ways that they hadn't really before. I'll give an example. I have another story to tell. This is a very personal story, but I think it's worth telling to share it with others. This happened about 25 years ago to me, and I was teaching at Kainai High School, and as a social studies teacher in developing curriculum, one of my the people I worked most closely with there was the English teacher. Her name is Ramona Bighead, and Ramona is from the community, born and raised there, Blackfoot woman, strong Blackfoot woman, and so I really relied on her a lot for guidance and ideas, and especially language and culture. Together, Ramona and I created what we called the Elder Mentor Program, and so I don't think there was anything very creative or unique about what we did. When I think about it now, basically we had 3 male elders and 3 female elders. We invited them to the school and we asked them to speak to the kids. And they did. But in general, that approach wasn't very successful. And the elders tried to tell us that. Eventually one of them said, "Do we have to stay at the school? Can we leave the school?" And now that I think about it, it kind of makes me laugh to think that that hadn't occurred to us before. But anyway, we said, yeah, sure, that'd be great. Let's do that. So one of the first things that we did was they wanted us to, want the students to participate in a sweat lodge ceremony, which is a common tradition here on the prairies. But down there, males and females, they have different protocols and different things that they learn. So the guys in my class and the girls in my class, Ramona would go with the girls and I would go with the young men, and we were learning different things. And finally it was the day before the sweat lodge ceremony was supposed to take place. And I was feeling pretty good. I thought, all the arrangements were made, everything was ready. And it was the end of the school day and I was in my classroom just on my desk. I must have been marking something or whatever. And these 3 young men who were in my class, they came in my classroom and they closed the door behind them. So of course right away I thought, oh, that's interesting. What's up? So one of them said, we've never been in a sweat lodge, which was surprising for me, but of course now I understand that better. They said, we've never been in a sweat lodge and we're kind of worried we're going to look stupid and we're going to make mistakes. So can you give us some background or tell us what's going to happen so we know what to expect? And I said, well, that's not really my job to do that. What I'll do is I'll on my way home, I'll stop by and I'll talk to the elder. I'll see what he says. So I went, gave him some tobacco, and asked him, this is what these students said. What do you think about that? And he said, well, first he laughed. He had a good belly laugh. And then he said, yeah, we don't do things that way. He said, we don't have a seminar before we have a ceremony. He said, in our way, if you want to learn something, you have to commit to the process. And your learning will come through that commitment. You can't just stand back and be a spectator, he said. That's what they want. He said that we don't do things that way. So, okay. So next morning, I was in my room, those three guys came and I told them what he said. So the afternoon came and had the school van ready, and I was expecting all these young men in my class to show up, and none of them came. So of course I was kind of embarrassed about this, and this was before cell phones, so I drove down by myself to this beautiful place on the reserve, right by this beautiful river, and these three old men were waiting for us. So I pulled up by myself, and I was feeling kind of bad, kind of, looking at the ground, and I said, yeah, none of them came. And I thought, being kind of naive and inexperienced, I thought that we'd cancel. But the one old man, he said, well, no, we have to go ahead. He said we made prior arrangements. He's kind of going like this. We made arrangements. So he said, we have to go ahead with this. So I said, okay. So what happened on that afternoon is that those three old men turned their attention to me. And so I was the one who collected the rocks. I was the one who dug the hole. I was the one who cut the willows. I was the one who built the lodge. I was the one who started the fire. I was the one who picked the sage. But while I was doing all this, they took turns talking to me about what I was doing. And they told me stories about what I was doing. And they walked beside me as I was doing things. I'd never been taught like that ever before. And I think about that experience pretty much every day, because it was such a gift to be brought into that tradition that really I knew very little about. And what I know now is that in that holistic way, they were guiding me intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And they were like lifting me up. So I got to go in the ceremony with these three beautiful old men, and I would say that my own teaching and learning practices are, every time I'm engaged, I think about that experience, and I try to somehow touch just a little bit of that, of what they gave me at that time. Yeah. And so when I think about indigenous wisdom traditions, my mind goes to that experience and the groundedness of that, what happened on that day. And so for myself, and I don't think I'm done yet, but I think my unlearning colonialism began that day. That's when it started, about 25 years ago. And I'm still working on it. Yeah. If you go on YouTube, a couple of friends of mine, Narcissus Blood and Ryan Heavyhead, they're the ones who did the research on this. And so on YouTube there are lectures that they've given, mostly in the US actually, because the American Psychological Association was quite interested in what they came up with. So Maslow was a grad student at Columbia University in New York in the 30s. And he was working on his theory that became the hierarchy of needs that pretty much every undergrad in North America anyway learns about. I don't know, maybe it's more widespread than that. Anyways, his supervisor was a woman named Ruth Benedict, and Ruth Benedict basically said to him, that's interesting, but have you ever tried it with a culture not your own? Like, if you're going to universalize this, shouldn't you look at other people? And he said no. So through her connections, she managed to send him to Alberta. And there's a Blackfoot community east of Calgary. It's called Siksika. And that's where he was sent. And this was in the 30s, the height of the oppression, right? And so this was a time when you couldn't leave the reserve unless you had a pass, and the Indian agent was basically a dictator, right? So Maslow, first of all, he went to the Indian agent and asked, we want to do research here, is that okay? And, surprisingly, the Indian agent said, well, I think so, but I'll get some of the elders together and you can ask them. So this is actually a kind of a funny story, because apparently he had a couple of assistants with him, and one of them was a young woman. I can't remember her name. But anyway, so the elders assembled, and Maslow had a chance to explain his research and his interests, and he couldn't speak in an articulate way. He was so nervous. He kept kind of stumbling, and so finally the young woman stepped forward and explained it. So that's how Maslow, I can't remember how you say it in Blackfoot, but his Blackfoot name is Women Speak for Him. That's his Blackfoot name. That's how they remember him. So he was there, I think, for 5 months. And what my friends say, what they argue, is that the hierarchy of needs was nuanced by Blackfoot philosophy. And what they did is they talked to people in the community who had stories about when he was there, because they remember him when he was there. And they also got access to his notes. In Colombia still had them. And they spoke to, some of his colleagues are still alive. And so basically we're still alive. They may not be anymore, because this research was done almost 10 years ago now. Basically, they say that it would have been academic suicide to sort of claim that the Blackfoot had inspired him in these ways. But the reason I thought of that is what you were saying about the young child, because one of Maslow's big insights that became self-actualization was his observations of how children were treated in the Blackfoot community, and this what they call the ethic of non-interference, which is very common. And so the story that was shared, I'm not sure where my friends uncovered it, I can't remember, but the story is that Maslow was in someone's home on the reserve, and there was a gathering going on, the family was together, they were eating, or some kind of, maybe a birthday party or something, but he was there, and he was sitting in the corner as like a researcher, and he's observing everything, right? I guess, probably taking notes too, right? Anyways, there was a door next to where he was sitting, and I guess it was a old style heavy wooden door with a large doorknob, and he observed this young boy came, kind of walked his way through the crowd and went to the door, and he tried to open it, but it was too big and cumbersome and he couldn't. So he observed this boy struggle for several minutes with this, and what he observed was that the adults around the room appeared not to notice. And so right away in his reflections, he thought, well, what kind of people are these? Can't they see this boy needs help? And so I guess in his reflection, he resisted the urge to get up and open the door. So he waited. And eventually, he said the boy managed to get a hold of the doorknob and he opened the door.